All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Wine, Women, and Words. I am Michelle, and with me, of course, is Diana.
Hello.
And we have author Laura Morelli back with us. This is the second time we're having her join us. And today I'm having, yes, her join us. Yeah. And today we are going to be talking about her latest book, which is, of course, The Last Masterpiece, which is a novel of World War II Italy. And thank you so much for making time for us and coming back to hang out with us. We're very happy to have you here.
Hello, Michelle and Diana. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm delighted to be here.
We should warn you, though, that on your fifth time on this podcast, we're going to give you out punch cards. And on the fifth time, the sixth time, we come to you and we record with you.
Oh, that would be great. I can just serve wine directly.
There you go. Yes, that began as a joke. I don't know how long ago, but now we actually have authors who have hit the fifth time on the show or who are approaching the fifth time. And it's like, all right, Wine, Women, and Words road trip has to...
Time to get together. Yeah.
Next summer, Michelle, we're going to Boston.
Right? So now you're progressing. So now you know, you've been warned.
I'm here for it.
So for our listeners who may not yet be familiar with The Last Masterpiece, can you give us an overview of what the novel is about?
Yes. So The Last Masterpiece takes us on a heart-pumping journey up the boot of Italy between 1943 and 1945. And at the heart of the story is the looting of the Florentine art collections, irreplaceable masterpieces from the Uffizi galleries, the Pitti Palace, these works of Western civilization that all of us recognize immediately. There were some 700 paintings and sculptures that were looted from Tuscany during World War II and spirited away all the way to the Austrian border. It's an incredible true story, and I was so inspired to use it as a backdrop for this novel, which is about two women, one American and one German, who are on the trail of these looted masterpieces and trying to figure out what has happened to them. But of course, they are on opposite sides of the war, which makes for some interesting conflict.
And for me, I found it was so interesting when I was reading it, and seeing it from both sides of this perspective. It really felt like it was two sides of the same coin in some regards, because they both love the art, but yet they found themselves working on two different ends of the spectrum. Like everybody wanted to get the art for themselves, it felt like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most fascinating things about Italy during World War II is you have all of these different factions. So, you've got the Italians themselves, the Italian people who maybe weren't so excited to be at war at all, no matter who was looked like they were going to win. You've got the Germans who, of course, were allied with Italy was allied with the Germans for the first half of the war. You have the partisans inside of Italy who were fighting against the Germans. And then you have the Allies coming in, bombing a lot of the major cities, of course, across northern Italy, and then working their way up the boot of Italy. And so there were just so many factions and so many stakeholders in the Italian peninsula during this time. It was a very complicated set of circumstances. And World War II stories are so popular right now. And I think one of the reasons why is that we have all of these individual stories that are so interesting. I mean, these stories of individual decisions and circumstances that people could never imagine themselves in. And in Italy in particular, you have all these shades of gray because things were not black and white at all. And so that was one of the things that inspired this story for me, was to look at these different viewpoints and the same set of historical circumstances through different lenses and different points of view. And the looting of this Florentine these Florentine art collections was kind of the perfect storm for looking at the different viewpoints, because there was a lot of focus on these works of art as they made their way northward.
Sorry. We need to have our little
we need to, yes.
signs. I was just thinking that historical fiction, one of the great things of historical fiction is it gives us the chance to learn about, like you mentioned, all those individual stories and those stories or those people or groups or movements that have been lost to history, particularly in World War II. You know, there's so much of the overarching themes and events and you know, the key players and people in it that we're very familiar with, but historical fiction gives us the chance to get to know the people that made huge sacrifices, huge contributions, but don't get the same exposure to us today that they deserve.
Yeah, I think you're completely right about that. And, you know, an example of that is, you know, we in the English speaking world are familiar with the stories of the Monuments Men, thanks to the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, the wonderful books by Robert Edsel and Ilaria Dagnini Bray. There have been some wonderful books, of course, a movie about the Monuments Men. So we in America and Canada, in the UK, we're familiar with these stories. But, you know, the Monuments Men actually sort of belong to the final chapter of World War II when these works needed to be restituted. But there's an entire, you know, part of this story from the beginning that pertains to these Italian art superintendents and curators who were frantically hiding these masterpieces in the countryside as the tensions began to mount across Europe. There were German art professionals who were collaborating with the Italians, who were helping to preserve monuments. That's a really fascinating set of circumstances. So there's this whole beginning of the story that I think we're not as familiar with in the English-speaking world, and that was one of the things that I wanted to discover and uncover and tell in this book.
So in the book, one of the things, and I cannot wait to have this discussion with you from the moment it came up in the book. For me, it felt very much like seeing an old friend or a cameo of somebody that I knew previously when you brought up Caserta and what happened to Caserta during World War II, because it's obviously when I wrote about Antoinette's sister, Caserta was a big part of what I wrote about. And you get to talk about what happened to that palace during World War II. And so I just want to kind of touch on that because I want to know about your research, because I had to do some research around what I think you probably researched.
Yeah, Caserta is really interesting. And, you know, for those of you who maybe have been to Italy before, you know, for the next time, definitely put Caserta on your list of places to visit. It's outside of Naples in the countryside. And it's known often as the Versailles of Italy. And I believe in the 18th century, it was the largest palace in Europe. I mean, the thing is just absolutely massive. It's
still considered the largest palace.
Baroque palace. Yeah. And it was used for so many different things from the time that it was constructed during the Bourbon dynasty. But during World War II, it was partially damaged by Allied bombing. And then the Allies actually used it as their headquarters. And then it was where the armistice was signed in 1945. So it really plays a very important role between 1943 and 45. For my story in the last masterpiece, it was notably a place where there were lots of women from the Women's Army Corps who were billeted there. The Women's Army Corps was a division of the Army. They were attached to the Fifth Army in Italy. They were the first women soldiers who were not considered auxiliary to the U.S. Army, but were actually embedded with the troops. They followed right behind enemy lines. They were cooks, bakers, telephone operators, logistics specialists, stenographers, and they were following just behind the men. They were doing all the grunt work, all the thankless grunt work, so that the men could go off to the front lines and fight. And there was a large contingent of these WACs, these Women Army Corps gals, as they were known, who billeted at Caserta, and they were working in the mailroom, they were making food, they were typing, they were plugging these big plugs into the switchboards. And so that provided a really great setting for Josie, who is one of our main characters, who comes from a very humble background in Connecticut and finds herself kind of caught up in this environment of the Fifth Army WACs in Italy, and she's staying at Caserta. The WACs were, General Douglas MacArthur noted that they worked harder and were more dedicated than his men, that they didn't complain. He called them his best soldiers. And there were many of these women who won military awards, but if you read their firsthand accounts, they were very self-deprecating. They were very funny. I mean, the things that they chose to talk about and commentate on were not the things that you might imagine. They were very, very entertaining to read. But Caserta is really such a great setting for a story, these women in uniform and men in uniform in this just fantastic Baroque palace.
It was interesting for me when I was doing my research, and in my book, of course, I've got a scene in the, it's not the church that's there. It's not a cathedral, but it's, they call it something else. And when I was initially doing my research, I was looking at the pictures of how it is today. And I was also looking at the blueprints on the website, which Caserta's website was wonderful for research for that. But I came across something on the website where they're like, oh yeah, so much of this was destroyed in World War II. And there was this picture on their website of what happened to the church, and or what they actually say chapel, what happened to the chapel. And I was just like, oh my God, I have to go back and look at everything, all the research again, and rework this. And when we were editing the book with the copy editor, that was something that she and I had to really go over because of what happened during World War II. And the fact that Maria Carolina had plans for the chapel, but then she changed her plans for the chapel. So what plans that were there weren't actually there in between the planning and World War II.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, I mean, those are the types of rabbit holes that we go down as historical novelists, right?
Yeah.
It's all of a sudden 3 hours later.
Yeah, exactly.
I hadn't realized. Oh, sorry. We need our signs. I hadn't realized. I don't think I knew that the armistice was signed at Caserta. It's either been buried somewhere way back, or I never knew that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting place, and if you have time, go on YouTube. You can see a lot of videos of these high-ranking military officials in the palace during that era. It's just incredible to have that video.
When I was there last September, I think you and I actually kind of missed each other when we were both in Naples, if memory serves me correctly. But when I was there, they didn't, I don't recall them having any kind of notification where the armistice was signed within the palace. Because we were going around touring the palace itself, I didn't see any of that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me across Italy how, there are these really important things that happened in the 20th century that are kind of not really noted. I mean, this last research trip I did in Florence, I feel like I've been to Florence so many times. I've stayed there so long. And this last research trip, I saw things that I had never seen before because I was digging, I was digging for this era and this set of circumstances. I was talking to people I'd never talked to before. I was visiting buildings and places I'd never seen before. And I thought, wow, this is interesting that it's not well known at all. I mean, I was in the Excelsior Hotel for a couple of days talking with the management there, and that was the German headquarters in Florence during World War II. All the Nazi officials were staying there. There's no, plaque on the wall or anything like that about it. They didn't know anything about it, the people that I spoke with there, and they were very gracious and, helped unlock lots of doors and let me go in and look at these rooms and these places where I knew they were, because I had done the research, but there's no kind of public knowledge about it or public sharing about it. So it's definitely an era that still deserves to be explored a lot more.
I think especially in Italy, because when so my brother-in-law is stationed in France, and when I was in France as well, I think I saw a lot of World War II related things there, like memorials and whatnot. And one of his only job while he was there, because he was in a graduate program, was to go and just show up in his uniform at these World War II memorial sites for these I don't want to call them celebrations, for memorials that they would do for the war. And it's interesting to see the flip side in Italy of it. And I wonder if it has anything to do about the fact that they entered the war with Germany under the German, as German allies.
Alliance, with the Germans. I know it is interesting. And that's what makes Italy so interesting, I think, during this period, as you see all of these, the flip-flopping, the of sides and all of the different motivations, complicated motivations of the different individuals, in whatever slice of the story you choose to research.
I'm just having a good time listening to you guys talk about Italian history.
I mean, you give us about the rest of the podcast, we could sit here and talk Italian history all hour long. And I say hour when we're only supposed to be like a half hour.
So I know on our list, we have our plotting versus pantsing question, which is part of our very super scientific survey. And I can't remember if we were doing it. I don't think we were asking this question the last time you were on the show. So we've been asking authors for about a year now, or over a year, whether they are plotters or pantsers. And then on the flip side, because to give you that, you would think by now I would have like a whole shtick memorized.
You want me to do the shtick?
Yes, you do it. You do it.
All right. So here's the shtick. Here's the official thing that we present to authors when we do the super scientific. Yes. So with me, I am very much a plotter. I have everything all plotted out. And I even, like, yesterday I was working on my book and I was going back and I was changing stuff within my plot line because I like to have it all nice and neatly organized. On the flip side of it, in my life, in my home, I'm perfectly okay with chaos. I have organized bins where I have a bin for things in there. Nothing is organized within it. This is you see the bookshelf behind me, for those of you listening, is ordered by color. That is the most organized I will ever get in my life. Now, Michelle, on the other side, she likes to just show up, and whatever her characters tell her is going to happen that day is going to happen that day. She likes to be surprised by her characters at her plot. But in her personal life, she likes to have everything nice and neatly organized. And that's the way she is.
Lists are my friends.
And
All the
lists give me
lists.
anxiety. So now we started noticing a trend, and we started asking other authors about this. So the first half of this question is, are you a plotter or are you a pantser?
So I am an uber plotter. I mean,
Okay.
like I'm very much a plotter. And it's kind of strange because my first book, I actually pantsed. And I don't know why, but the only thing I can say is that I didn't really know what I was doing. And it took forever. It took years. And so I am a super plotter, but I also recognize that there are some downsides to being an uber plotter. It's not the perfect solution. I think that one thing that can happen is, I mean, the good thing about it is I think that you don't waste as many words if you're a plotter. It's a little bit more efficient in that regard, but there are some downsides. One is, I think sometimes the story just wants to go where it wants to go, and you have to abandon your plot or constantly rejigger it, which I do. I constantly am in there, tweaking and redoing things in my plot. But also something that can happen, I think, if you're a big plotter, is that it can a little bit take the wind out of your sails. Like if you have a great idea for something and you're excited about it and you get it all down on paper or in Scrivener or whatever you're working on, then you're like, okay, I'm done. Like I've told my story. And then maybe it's sort of, you lose a little bit of momentum, or you lose a little bit of the will to actually go back and write it. You've sort of worked it all out in your head. So, it's not a perfect thing. It's one is not better than the other. I think that everybody has such a different process. So I don't judge.
I honestly, I don't think one is better than the other. I think I did not plot properly for my last book. I'll be honest, the one that, my last work in progress, and I was very mad at myself about having to go back and pants a lot of it, and I hated it. Every single moment of it, I was miserable.
I got very angry text messages about pantsing during that period.
Michelle could see me with my hands up, like a good old Italian, going, "How can you do this? Why
did you the?"
So now the other half of this question: are you somebody who likes to keep everything nice and neatly organized, like Michelle, or are you okay with there being some chaos around you?
I wish I could say I was nice and neatly organized. I would love to be. I mean, I would love to have everything in like neat little bins and sub bins and all of that. But I have 4 kids, and that has just gone out the window.
Oh, yeah.
And so, my husband comes home and says, "How can you get anything done?" He takes one look at my desk, and I've got big piles of clutter and everything, and there's stuff laying around, and the bed's unmade, and there's just chaos in the house, and I don't see it at all. It's as if I've left the house and I've gone to an office somewhere. I have complete blinders on from the chaos. And I think that sometimes happens if you work from home for over a long span of years. You have to create these boundaries for yourself. Otherwise, you can't really get anything done. So I have very clear boundaries about, okay, now I'm at work, and now I'm not at work. Now I'm at home, even though I'm in the same space. So no, things are not organized. I wish.
Yeah, I love that question so much. I mean, we started doing it as our scientific question just because we're curious about it. And then it just kind of turned into this question where we actually get to find out how other authors do their writing, and we get a glimpse into their writing process, and we get to see a little bit of it. And then, of course, I think there's also this whole nosy aspect of, are you a chaotic person like me, or are you nice and neatly organized?
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? How everybody is so different in how they approach writing, and we all end up with a finished book at some point, but the way we get there is so individual.
Yeah, and it's great to hear that there's no one way to write a book. Just like in today's age, there's no one way to publish a book. There's no one way to write a book.
Absolutely.
And we've had authors tell us that they write, whatever scene they feel like that day, where they don't write in order, or I want to say someone writes backwards at some, maybe not.
They
Maybe
write
not.
the first, they write the first part, and then they write the end, and then they just connect the dots.
Then they fill it in, or plotters who are very, very strict plotters, and I applaud that, because I try, and then I'll write out an outline and go, oh, I'm organized, and then I'll follow like the first point of the outline and then veer off in a completely opposite direction, and the outline is just there.
Well, I think the thing about plotting, which makes the successful point I feel about plotting, is that it's the pirate's way of plotting, where they're more like guidelines, where you have this touchstone that you can go back to, be like, okay, I'm kind of stuck. Did I write myself in the corner here? And then you can go back to the plot and be like, oh, okay, this is where I did here, and this is where I meant to go here. So you kind of have this roadmap. You could still take shortcuts and go the long way around, but you have a place where you can be like, okay, this is how I get to the 7-Eleven down the street.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is where I need to end up.
Yeah. I definitely, have sort of tent poles in my plot, and I don't write in order at all. I completely write out of order. But I find that the scenes that I often write first are the ones that are kind of like tent poles. They're the things that are holding up the entire spine. And then between the tent poles, I can kind of just find my way, like I know I've got to start here and get there within a certain number of pages. And then it can be a little bit loose, getting there, or I can sort of feel a flow from getting to tent pole 1 to tent pole 2, if that makes sense.
It does. And that makes me think, so my first 2 books are about somebody specific, a specific person in history. So I had to have those tent poles, because there are certain things in the historical record that I cannot change about their life story. Yeah. And for you, with your books, you have events, and especially with World War II, there'll be people that will call you out if you do not have a specific event at a
100%. Yes.
So you've got to have those specific points in your story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always start with a really detailed timeline, and that often does sort of reveal what the tent poles are. And there's always when writing historical fiction, I think there's always a tension between the actual historical timeline and the narrative drive of the story. And sometimes they sort of fit together nicely, and very often they don't. And so I think part of the puzzle is, as a historical novelist, is making story decisions, and saying, well, actually, there was like a big lag time between these 2 important events, but that's really boring for a fictional story. And so we have to tighten it up somehow. So I find that a lot of the plotting is about that. It's about reconciling the historical timeline with the story timeline, because you want to keep the reader turning the pages. You want to have a narrative drive and a solid story structure that's going to keep them reading. And so at the same time, people come to historical fiction in part, I think, because they want to go away smarter. They want to learn something. They want to follow a true historical set of circumstances or events. So you have to somehow balance those 2 things. And so I think I always loved putting puzzles together as a kid. And I think that this is sort of like the grown-up version of putting puzzles together.
That is so very true. Now, to find our way back to our questions and some of the stuff in the book itself, one thing I liked was Josie and Ava. Like I liked both of those characters, and oftentimes, I mean, you can reading books, you could be like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna, especially if they're dual narrative, be like, yeah, I'm gonna root for this one, or yeah, I want, I don't want this chapter to end. I don't want to go to the next person, but I didn't really feel that in your book between Josie and Ava, and I actually like them both. There was no like one over the other kind of situation with the two of them. Let's talk for a minute about how you crafted each of those characters.
Yeah, so with Josie, she's our American whack who grows up the daughter of a single mom who's a cleaning lady at Yale University. So we have this big dichotomy between classes, between this Ivy League environment and this blue collar woman who's gotten a job as a typist at the Yale Art Gallery. She really doesn't know anything about art. She doesn't have high aspirations, and yet she's pulled into this drama of being a whack and being sent on a ship over to Italy and then being assigned as a stenographer to work with one of the monuments men. And so she's pulled into the world of art history and great masterpieces. It's an arena that she never thought that she would be part of. And then on the other side of the coin, we have Ava, who is a German. She's the daughter of an esteemed art historian in Germany. And he's been called to work in the Alt-Aussee salt mines in Austria, which is a place where the Nazis hid thousands of works of art, their own masterpieces, to hide them from destruction and protect them from destruction. And also it became an important repository for looted works of art that they brought from other parts of Europe. So she's a little bit more cultivated. Her mother was a journalist, so she's a little bit more sophisticated. She has ambitions to go out and make a difference in the world. And her father arranges for her to go and be a photographer at the German Art History Institute in Florence. Unfortunately, she arrives on the eve when Italy switches sides and is no longer an ally of Germany. And so she's in this odd position of working for this German academic institution, but she is in this situation where things are very murky. No one knows if the Germans in their city are friends or foes. There are German troops coming in. Florence is soon an occupied city and people are stuck inside. And the role of the Germans in art preservation is very complicated. You see, at the beginning of the war, there were Germans who were collaborating with the Italian art officials to whisk away these masterpieces by Raphael and Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, et cetera, out into the countryside. And so they knew where everything was, which was a little inconvenient when Italy switched sides and suddenly the Germans were enemies. So Ava and Josie both find themselves working to quote unquote protect works of art and to safeguard works of art. But I think you can see that it was a very complicated matter. And certainly as these 700 plus works of art were looted and whisked away to the Austrian border, things got very complicated indeed. So we follow the path of both of these women from the south to the north, all the way to the Alps. And I think that the true story behind all of that is it's incredible. It's an incredible story. I am doing a 3-part lecture series this summer about the story behind the looted masterpieces of Florence. It's called Looting the Uffizi. And if this airs in time, you can sign up at lauramorelli.com/masterpiece. And it's a 3-part series that tells the story of these masterpieces going up the boot of Italy between 1943 and 45. So sign up if it's a story you're interested in.
And it's definitely fascinating. And that time period that this book is set in was such a great area between their relationship between Italy and Germany. Because, I mean, we see things don't necessarily go well if you're an enemy of Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is I think in fiction, we all know that the best bad guys, the best villains are those who have some sort of a rationale for what they're doing. You know, they believe that they're doing something important, or they have a really important reason for what they're doing. And we see this, you know, we see among the German population in Italy that, you know, there are good guys, there are bad guys, and even the bad guys had a rationale for what they were doing. And so it makes for some very interesting characters, I think, for a fictionalized story.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wine, Women, and Words. Be sure to check out our show notes to pre-order your copy of The Last Masterpiece and sign up for Laura Morelli's class. Enrollment ends July 31st, and her book comes out on August 1st. Also, for just $3, you can help support Wine, Women, and Words by following the link in our show notes and buying us a cup of coffee. Thanks, and happy reading!